Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. It was another busy week and another successful week at the summer box office as Inside Out 2 remained number one and A Quiet Place Day 1 also posted a strong debut, especially considering it was yet another movie that was budgeted smartly. So let's jump right into the weekend top 10. And Inside Out 2 remained the box office champ in a fairly close race. $57.4 million is good enough for number one, a 44.4% drop from last week, so another pretty good hold. Inside Out 2's weekend gross is the 8th best third weekend of all time, just behind the Super Mario Bros. Movie and ahead of Spider-Man No Way Home. And Inside Out 2 is now nearing $470 million domestically. We have a lot more to say about those numbers. A Quiet Place Day 1 extended the streak that we've been seeing the last few weeks of movies overperforming what their estimates were. It comes in at an estimated number of $53 million. So two movies above $50 million at the box office. The last time that both top two movies were over $50 million was last July 28th, which was week 2 of Barbenheimer. That's a pretty good comparison when we're talking about box office. In third place was Kevin Costner's Western Horizon, an American Saga, Chapter 1, which debuted with a pretty low $11 million considering that the whole movie trilogy supposedly has a cost well over $100 million. That's split up amongst different movies, so we'll see how this does, how it holds up. It's an adult skewing title. Perhaps it'll have legs at the box office, but not the debut they were looking for, and certainly not what Mr. Costner was looking for, considering he's reportedly put in tens of millions of dollars of his own money into this series. In fourth place was Bad Boys Ride or Die in its fourth week of release, still holding strong, a 45.2% drop, another $10.3 million, and its domestic total is now at $165.2 million. In fifth place is the Indian epic Kalki 2898 AD, which made $5.4 million. That's good enough to break into the top 5. It opened earlier in the week, so it's made nearly $11 million domestically. This is a Punjabi language sci-fi epic and reportedly the most expensive Indian film ever, and played in many markets around the world, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. In sixth place was The Bike Riders with a 66% drop and a $3.3 million total. Its domestic total is now $16.2 million. I think Horizon may be looking at that with a little bit of trepidation because that's another adult skewing film that you would think might have long legs at the box office, but that's a pretty steep drop in weekend number 2. The Garfield movie in week 6 drops 47% with a $2 million total. Its domestic total is now at $89.6 million. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes spends an 8th week in the top 10. It dropped 55.4% for a $1.7 million total. Its domestic total now stands at just over $168 million. Another film from India breaks into the top 10. Jat and Juliet 3 made $1.5 million. It opened earlier in the week, so it has a $1.8 million total, reportedly. This is a Punjabi language movie and the first film in this franchise in over a decade. And then rounding out the top 10 is Yorgos Lanthimos' Kinds of Kindness, which had an expansion into about 500 theaters this past weekend. Its business went up 297.6%, and it came in, according to estimates, just behind Jat and Juliet 3 at $1.5 million. Its domestic total now stands at just over $2 million. So let's start by looking at this past weekend for Inside Out 2, where it stands as far as box office weekends and where the movie stands domestically as far as its overall total. When we look at third weekend grosses of this decade of the 2020s, Inside Out 2 had the third best. Avatar: The Way of Water had the best third weekend gross of the decade at $67.4 million, followed by the Super Mario Bros. Movie at $59.9 million, but Inside Out 2 is right behind at $57.4 million according to estimates. Spider-Man No Way Home came in at $56 million in its third weekend, and then the top 5 is rounded out by Barbie in its third weekend last August. As far as third weekend grosses for an animated film, again, Inside Out 2 comes in just behind the Super Mario Bros. Movie, $59.9 million to $57.4 million. Incredibles 2 had the third best third weekend gross for an animated film at $46.4 million, then Finding Dory at $41.8 million, and Shrek 2 at $37.9 million, although keep in mind those are unadjusted numbers from 20 years ago. Shrek 2 was really a massive blockbuster that summer. And as far as the highest grossing animated films of all time domestically, unadjusted for inflation, Inside Out 2 has now broken into that top 5 at $469.3 million. It's less than $10 million behind Frozen 2. It's less than $20 million behind Finding Dory. It should easily surpass both of those films today or tomorrow. And then the question is, how high can it go? I think it's pretty much a lock that it's going to pass the Super Mario Brothers movie at $574.9 million. And really, that puts it well within range of Incredibles 2 at $608.5 million. So we are really looking at some upward mobility here, as seen by the franchise tracker for Pixar. Inside Out 2, after just 3 weekends of release, is now the third highest grossing Pixar movie of all time at $469.3 million, behind just Finding Dory and Incredibles 2. It has bypassed movies like Toy Story 4, Toy Story 3, Finding Nemo, and the original Inside Out. And even when we look at these numbers adjusted for inflation, Inside Out 2 is now officially a top 10 Pixar movie. It's past the inflation-adjusted totals of The Incredibles and Toy Story 2. It is very close to passing the original Inside Out adjusted for inflation, so this is a sequel that will have a broader appeal box office-wise than the original. And when we look at this next week, the July 4th weekend, I think it's almost certain that this is going to be a top 5 movie, bypassing Toy Story 4 by next week, and we'll see what it does throughout the week. Could it even get to that number 4 spot where Toy Story 3 is? I don't know if it's going to get to Incredibles 2 as far as adjusted for inflation numbers, but still, this is a top 5 Pixar hit domestically adjusted for inflation. It could very well be their biggest hit of all time domestically, and it's making a bunch of noise worldwide, where it became the fastest animated film to cross $1 billion, and we'll look at those numbers when we look at the worldwide box office. As far as where the domestic box office could wind up, this is how Inside Out 2 compares to Incredibles 2, which is the highest grossing animated film of all time domestically, and Barbie, which was the highest grossing film of last summer. And you can see that it has really opened up on a day-by-day basis, a much bigger lead on Incredibles 2 than it saw during 10 days. So those legs are really starting to take off. That's a great sign as far as it taking that number 1 spot for an animated film domestically. And it's also opening up its lead over Barbie compared to last summer. Barbie was the number 1 movie last year. If Inside Out 2 keeps up this pace, if it remains ahead of Barbie, we're looking at a gross at least in the $650 million range, which could displace Jurassic World as the 10th highest grossing domestic movie ever. It's currently the 24th highest grossing movie on the all-time domestic chart. So it is continued phenomenal success for Inside Out 2, but let's not neglect the movie that ran it a close second, which was A Quiet Place Day 1. Looking at some of the stats for its opening weekend, it was the highest horror opening of 2024, and it wasn't even close. $53 million bumps The Strangers Chapter 1 down to second place at $11.8 million, and A Quiet Place Day 1 is actually the highest grossing horror film overall of 2024 already, because The Strangers Chapter 1 had that title. So a big breakout in the horror genre for this year. And as far as the horror genre this decade, A Quiet Place Day 1 had the second biggest opening for a horror film in the 2020s, behind only Five Nights at Freddy's, which opened last October with $80 million. We have A Quiet Place Day 1 in second place with $53 million. Then Halloween Kills at $49.4 million. A Quiet Place Part 2 at $47.5 million. So one franchise, 2 spots on this list. And then Scream 6 back in 2023 at $44.4 million. And as far as the Quiet Place franchise, this was the highest opener in franchise history at $53 million. It tops the $50.2 million opening weekend of the original Quiet Place back in 2018 and the $47.5 million opening of A Quiet Place Part 2 back in 2021, although I think that opening would have been higher had this not come so early in the theater reopening cycle. This is one of the first major movies after theaters were reopened after the COVID-19 closures. When we adjust those numbers for inflation, things change a bit. A Quiet Place has the biggest opening at $62.7 million. A Quiet Place Part 2 comes in second at $55.1 million, and A Quiet Place Day 1 comes in third at $53 million. But when you look at those numbers, the fact that it opened pretty much at the same level as A Quiet Place Part 2, which was a sequel starring much of the same cast as the original, I think that shows that there is some big support for this franchise generally, and not just Emily Blunt and John Krasinski as stars in the movie. People were interested in the concept. They wanted to see what it had to offer. As far as cinema scores, it got about the same reception as the other movies in the franchise. Now, I'm sure that means that A Quiet Place is now going to be franchised to death, But when we saw a similar movie, in many respects, in Furiosa earlier this year, a prequel movie with a different cast, not do well at the box office, we see another movie like A Quiet Place Day One succeed at the box office. And I think this says a lot about the franchise. Maybe people were just more interested in A Quiet Place as a franchise than they were Mad Max with Furiosa, and we're seeing the difference as far as the box office money. As far as final domestic gross, if A Quiet Place Day One holds up like the other movies in the franchise, then we're looking at a final domestic gross probably around $150 to $175 million. But this is a movie that's also in a very competitive summer marketplace. So we'll see how it holds up, particularly over this holiday weekend when a lot of other options are also entering the theatrical window. All the new movies in the top 10 means that we also had a lot of turnover. Half of the top 10 turned over from last weekend. If is out of the top 10 after 6 weeks, so John Krasinski giveth and John Krasinski taketh away from himself as far as top 10 movies. The Watchers is out of the top 10 after 3 weeks, and then we have 3 one-week wonders. Russell Crowe's The Exorcism, Thelma, and Ghost right here, right now are all out of the top 10 after 1 week. Right here, right now, of course, was a special event, so that's not a huge surprise. Looking at the biggest theater count changes for this past weekend, well, If is out of the top 10 because it lost literally exactly half of its theaters. You don't see that a whole lot. It lost 1,252 theaters. It's still playing in 1,252 theaters. The Garfield movie lost almost exactly the same amount. It lost 1,251 theaters. It's still playing in 1,762. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes lost 760 theaters. It's still playing in 1,650. The Fall Guy falls out of wide release. It lost 598 theaters. It's still playing in 513. And then Kinds of Kindness added 485 theaters for the 5th biggest theater count change of the past weekend. It's now playing in 490 theaters total. Looking at what I call the road to recovery, and that name has been called into question, this box office weekend was pretty much flat with last box office weekend, which is not bad because last weekend wasn't terrible. It is right in the middle still between where we were from 2015 to 2019 and where we have been for the 2021 to 2023 window, and hopefully we're going to see a big spike this upcoming weekend with a lot of new movies entering the marketplace. The highest performing film for the 2021 to 2023 window was Minions: The Rise of Gru. Of course, the Minions are back this upcoming weekend in Despicable Me 4. The highest performing film in the 2015 to 2019 window narrowly was the second weekend of Finding Dory, which had its own impressive box office run for Pixar several years ago. So we are at the end of June, we're at the halfway point in the year, and let's look at some of the overall box office stats, which we're doing about every month or so. And let's look first at the box office market share for 2024. This is basically every ticket bought since January 1st. How much money is each studio taking home as a percentage of those overall sales? And when we look at where we were at the end of June, we had about $2.5 billion in total box office. Warner Brothers was the easy leader at 26% of the total market share. Universal had 20%, Sony had 12.45%, Paramount had 9.21%. Disney was by far the lowest of the 5 major studios at 7.7% market share because it hadn't really put much into the marketplace. Lionsgate and Amazon were both around 6%, and all other studios were at 12%. Well, what a difference one Pixar hit can make, because this is the current box office at the end of June, about $1 billion more as far as box office business, and it is much more competitive. Warner Brothers is still number one with 20.4% market share, but it lost about 6% from where we were a month ago. Universal loses about 5% market share. It's at 15%. Sony increased their share by around 3%. Paramount stayed flat, but Disney picked up about 12% market share due pretty much solely to the success of Inside Out 2. So it now has the second biggest share of the theatrical marketplace this year at 19.93%, and it's really just behind Warner Brothers. So this is a big turnaround for Disney with their big hit. And keep in mind, they've got another one on deck in July with Deadpool and Wolverine. So we should probably anticipate that this market share is going to grow. Perhaps Disney will have the overall lead in 2024 market share in a month or 2 months. Lionsgate and Amazon both lost a little bit of market share. They're both over 4%. And the All Others tab, which includes A24 and other studios, is at just over 10%. This is something else we've been looking at, the cumulative domestic box office month over month. So when we looked at it back at the end of May, so this is the months January through May, cumulative box office for 2024 was a little less than $1 billion behind 2023 and about $270 million behind where we were at that point in 2022. So let's look at where we are through June, and we have closed the gap due to a largely successful slate of movies. We're now only around $840 million behind where we were at the end of June in 2023 and about $110 million behind where we were in 2022. That's good news, but if there's any hope of keeping pace, these movies that are coming out, Twisters, Despicable Me 4, Deadpool and Wolverine, need to keep hitting, because remember, last July was the beginning of the whole Barbenheimer phenomenon. So if we want to try to keep pace with the box office last summer and last year, or even try to keep closing that gap, then we need these movies to really do well, because it is really a tough task to ask the July box office this year to replicate what we did last year, not to mention the spillover effect that happened in August. So we'll continue tracking this, but this is somewhat strong news or positive news. Instead of falling further behind where we've been, we actually have been able to close that gap over the last month. All right, let's look now outside of the domestic marketplace to the top 5 films internationally. Inside Out 2 banked another $108 million over this past weekend outside of the US and Canada. A Quiet Place Day 1 was in second place at a $45.5 million international debut. And by the way, yes, that is an actual poster for A Quiet Place Day 1. That's not something I mocked up or something a fan made. That is just marketing strategy in different countries. Kalki 2898 also had a strong debut around the world at $37.6 million. Despicable Me 4 continued its early international play at $13.8 million. And China's Moments We Shared comes in fifth place at $13.5 million. When you combine those international numbers with our domestic numbers, we get our top 5 films worldwide. And the number 1 movie once again worldwide was Inside Out 2, another $165.4 million over the weekend, just a 37.4% drop from last weekend. A Quiet Place Day 1 banks almost $100 million in its worldwide debut. Keep in mind, this was a movie that was reportedly budgeted between $60 and $70 million, so it doesn't have the same high stakes as far as overall gross. This is a good debut for the film. As long as the bottom doesn't drop out completely, then it has a great shot at being profitable in the theatrical window. In third place was Kalki 2898 AD with a $43 million overall worldwide debut. Bad Boys Ride or Die drops down to number 4, but a strong hold, 45.3% from last weekend, another $23.4 million. And Despicable Me 4 expanded into other markets. Its business went up 49.5% for a $13.8 million worldwide weekend. That number should go up drastically this upcoming weekend as it opens in the US and a lot of other markets. And just to put into context how successful Inside Out 2 is, these are the top 5 worldwide weekend grosses for 2024, not just opening weekends. And you can see that Inside Out 2 now has 3 of the 5 highest grossing weekends for any movie released worldwide this year. You had its debut weekend, which brought in $294.2 million. Its second weekend, which brought in $265.6 million. Then you had the debut of Godzilla Kong: The New Empire at $194 million. The debut of Dune Part 2 at $182.5 million. And week 3 of Inside Out 2 at $165.4 million. That's just how good it's doing. It is putting up worldwide debut numbers so far every single week of its release. And when we look at the Pixar franchise tracker by worldwide gross, it has now officially crossed that $1 billion mark worldwide. It's the fastest animated film to ever do that. And it is also the 5th highest grossing film in Pixar's history worldwide. It joins the other 4 movies that have broken $1 billion: Finding Dory, Toy Story 3, Toy Story 4, and Incredibles 2. And it really only has about $230-ish million left to overtake Incredibles 2. I think it should do that easily. So in a week or maybe 2 weeks, we're going to have have a new all-time box office champion worldwide for Pixar, and it's also going to start making its way up this list. These are the highest grossing animated films of all time worldwide. Now, right now, Inside Out 2 is just outside of that top 10, but it should be moving up this list very rapidly because it's only really right behind Zootopia at number 10, Finding Dory at number 9, Despicable Me 3 at number 8, Toy Story 3 at number 7, and Toy Story 4 at number 6. I think it is going to blow past all those 5 movies by next weekend, and I think it's very likely that next week when we talk, it'll be at number 5, having displaced Minions, which made $1.15 billion. Then it just has Incredibles 2, Frozen, the Super Mario Bros. Movie, and Frozen 2 in its way. Will it hit that $1.45 billion mark and become the highest grossing animated film of all time worldwide? Nothing has shown me any sort of suspension in its momentum. I think it is definitely headed that direction. The only X factor is Despicable Me 4. If Despicable Me 4 really sucks up that family market and puts a halt to Inside Out 2 in a significant way, I think that could arrest its climb up these charts, but we just don't know what that effect is going to be yet. There hasn't been great word of mouth on Despicable Me 4 thus far, so it could be that families will choose to continue going to see Inside Out 2, and we could see the impact on the box office for Despicable Me 4. That's just something we're going to have to wait and see as it rolls out around the world this week. We've got a lot more box office numbers to break down, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsors for this week's show. This episode's brought to you by Magic Spoon. I've loved cereal since I was a kid, and it's a frequent meal for me. It's kind of the perfect food, except that it can often contain a lot of sugar and empty carbs that aren't necessarily the best option. But with Magic Spoon, I can have my cereal and eat it too, combining the taste I love with less sugar and high protein. I have the Magic Spoon variety pack that contains 4 flavors: cocoa, fruity, frosted, and peanut butter. This pack has 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and 4 to 5 grams of net carbs with only 140 calories per serving. It's also high protein, has 0 grams of sugar, keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, and soy-free, and you can build your own bundle with your favorite flavors. My go-to recently has been the fruity flavor, but lately I've also been eating the cocoa flavor a lot, and it's great to have that chocolate taste, knowing that all the sugar you get with other cocoa-flavored cereals isn't also in the bowl. And Magic Spoon cereal stays crunchy in the milk, so I don't feel like I have to rush through my cereal to prevent a soggy mess. Go to magicspoon.com/movies to grab a variety pack and try it today, and be sure to use our promo code MOVIES at checkout to save $5 off your order. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee, so if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember, start your day off right with a delicious bowl of high-protein cereal at magicspoon.com/movies and use the code MOVIES to save $5 off. Thanks to Magic Spoon for sponsoring this video. This episode is brought to you by Miracle Made. It has been a hot summer pretty much everywhere this year, and Arkansas is no different, with high temperatures and humidity that make things feel like a swamp. If you're a hot sleeper like me, you know that bedroom temperature can have a huge impact on sleep quality, and if summer heat interrupts your sleep, I can't recommend Miracle Made sheets enough. Miracle Made sheets use silver-infused fabrics inspired by NASA that are temperature regulating so you can stay cool and sleep well. They're also incredibly comfortable without the huge price tag of other luxury brands, and they're self-cleaning, preventing up to 99.7% of bacterial growth that can clog your pores, causing acne and breakouts. Miracle Made sheets can last up to 3 times as long without washing as other sheets, which means that you can leave them on longer and make sure that your summer sleep never gets interrupted. Go to trymiracle.com/Dan to try Miracle Made sheets today. And whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo code Dan at checkout, you'll get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. Miracle is so confident in their product, it's backed by a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you aren't 100% satisfied, you'll get a free refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/Dan and use the code Dan to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40% off. Again, that's trymiracle.com/Dan to treat yourself. Thank you to Miracle Made for sponsoring this episode. All right, before we go on to the summer charts and some of the other box office numbers, I want to do a couple of revised charts from last week's show. We used the estimates since I moved the show to Monday. Sometimes when the final numbers come in, there are additions and things that we didn't have that final information. So I always want to provide those revisions and give you the most accurate information. First of all, the top 5 for June 21st through the 23rd, which we covered on last week's show. Inside Out 2's final number came in at $101.2 million. But really the revision here is Garfield and Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. Both of those movies laid claim to the same exact estimated box office number, but when it all shook out, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes ended up as the 4th highest grossing film of that weekend at $3.8 million. The Garfield movie came in just behind at $3.7 million. Also looking at the per theater averages for the 21st through the 23rd, Kinds of Kindness came in higher than the estimates. The estimate was at $70,000 per theater. It came in at $75,457 per theater in each of its 5 theaters. Also there at number 5, Vittorio De Sica's Shoeshine, a 4K restoration of that film, ended up as the 5th best per theater average. And the increase in Kinds of Kindness's final numbers actually put it over Poor Things as far as the best per theater averages of the 2020s. So it comes in at number 4 at $75,457 per theater, playing in 5 theaters. That's better than the $73,470 per theater that Poor Things put up back in December in 9 theaters. Again, the estimates had Kinds of Kindness at $70,000 per theater, which put it in that number 5 spot, but it was a popular film in very limited release. Also, one quick revision on the limited release films for June 21st through 23rd. There were a couple of movies that had not reported grosses when I did the show last week. Ghost Right Here, Right Now was still number 1. Kinds of Kindness was number 2. The documentary I Am Celine Dion, which played in 480 theaters, actually came in 3rd place on the limited release chart at $281,000. Ghostlight remained on the chart at number 4 at $265,000. And then Jesus, which was a film from the Deaf Ministries and was presented in American Sign Language, came in 5th place at $240,489. All right, let's look now at the 2024 summer box office charts. Not a whole lot has changed since last week. The top 7 are all the same. Inside Out 2, easily number 1 by $300 million. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is in 2nd place, but Bad Boys Ride or Die should surpass it next week to become the 2nd highest grossing film of the summer, unless Despicable Me 4 puts up huge numbers over the week. If is at number 4, The Fall Guys at number 5, the Garfield movies at number 6, and Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, is at number 7. A Quiet Place Day 1's $53 million opening is enough to put it at number 8 on the summer chart. The Strangers Chapter 1 drops down to number 9, and Tarot drops down to number 10. The Watchers drops off the chart altogether. And when we look at my predictions, I had A Quiet Place Day 1 as the 7th highest grossing film of the summer. I'm pretty comfortable with where I put it. So right now I have 6 out of my 10 predictions that are playing in theaters. They are all alive, although Furiosa Mad Max Saga will soon exit that chart. It's going to start getting bumped down pretty quickly. And then my pick for the highest grossing film of the summer, which was Despicable Me 4, opens this week, although I think it is highly doubtful that it is actually going to be the number 1 movie of the summer. We'll see where it does wind up on this chart. I've got 2 more movies opening in July that are on my top 10, Deadpool and Wolverine and Twisters, and then there's one movie that I put on my top 10 that's opening in August. We'll see if Alien Romulus can keep this horror hot streak going and be a sleeper pick for a top 10 summer movie. Turning down to the specialty charts, these were the highest per theater averages this past weekend. A Quiet Place Day 1, as per the estimated numbers, had the highest per theater average of the weekend at $14,293 per theater in each of its 3,708 theaters. Inside Out 2 comes in 2nd place. Very rare that we see 2 wide releases at number 1 and 2 at $12,928 in each of its 4,440 theaters. Jot and Juliet 3 brings in $10,518 in each of its 143 theaters, so it is a top 10 movie and a top 5 per theater movie. In 4th place was Last Summer, which brought in $10,100 per theater in 3 theaters. Last Summer is a French film about a woman who has an affair with her stepson. How French. In 5th place is the film June Zero, which is from director Jake Paltrow, brother of Gwyneth Paltrow, about the trial of notorious Nazi Adolf Eichmann. It brought in $8,142 in its sole theater. Looking at the top films in limited release, this is 1,000 theaters or fewer. Jot and Juliet 3 is at number 1, playing in 143 theaters. It brought in $1.5 million. In second place is Kinds of Kindness, which played in 490 theaters, an expansion in week 2. It brought in $1.500 million versus $1.504 million for Jot and Juliet 3. Pretty close race there. In third place was Blue Lock the Movie, episode Nagi, playing in 857 theaters. It brought in just over $1 million overall. Playing in 628 theaters is Daddy-O, which brought in $440,000. Stars Dakota Johnson as a woman who has a conversation with a cab driver played by Sean Penn on her way home from the airport in New York City, and it's set almost entirely inside the taxi. And then in fifth place is Janet Planet, which played in 315 theaters and brought in $187,000. Looking at the 2024 annual domestic box office, it is unchanged from last week. Inside Out 2 is at number 1, Dune Part 2 is in second place, Godzilla Kong the New Empire is in third, Kung Fu Panda 4 is in fourth place, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is in fifth place, although, as I mentioned before, Bad Boys Ride or Die is just behind it. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire is in seventh, If is in eighth, Bob Marley One Love is in ninth, and The Fall Guy is in 10th. This should start getting shaken up really quickly, starting with this July 4th weekend and moving through the rest of July. Looking at the 2024 worldwide box office, again, no change here, although we have our first billion-dollar movie of 2024, and I don't think it's the one that a lot of people thought that it was going to be, certainly not me. Inside Out 2 at number 1 at $1.014 billion. Dune Part 2 in second place. Godzilla Kong the New Empire is in third. Kung Fu Panda is in fourth. YOLO is in fifth. Pegasus 2 is in sixth. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is in seventh. Article 20 is in eighth. Bad Boys Ride or Die is in ninth. And Boonie Bears Time Twist is in 10th place. And when we look at the worldwide 365-day chart, this is from July 1st, 2023 to July 1st, 2024. Barbie remains number 1 at $1.4 billion. And the question here is, will Inside Out 2 chase it down in the 3 weeks before it rotates off of the charts? I think it's going to be a pretty big race. It has already surpassed the worldwide gross of Oppenheimer, which is now the third highest grossing film over the past 365 days. Then we have Dune Part 2 and Wonka rounding out the top 5, followed by Godzilla Kong the New Empire, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, Kung Fu Panda 4, and then 2 films from China, No More Bets and YOLO. Before we wrap things up, as I do almost every week here on the show, I want to take a look at a weekend from box office history, and we're going to go back 20 years to perhaps the most mid-2000s box office weekend that I can think of. This is June 25th through the 27th, 2004, and the number 1 movie was Michael Moore's documentary, I guess, Fahrenheit 9/11, which opened at $23.9 million. This was a documentary movie playing in limited release under 1,000 theaters that opened number 1 during the summer. This was an insane box office feat. It ended up at $119.1 million domestically. In second place is the Wayans brothers movie White Chicks, so much like Fahrenheit 9/11, at $19.6 million. It was a midweek opener, so it had made $27.1 million to that point. Its total was $69.1 million. Then we had Peak Frat Pack, Dodgeball, a true underdog story in its second week, dropping 37.5% for an $18.7 million total. Its domestic total to that point was $67.4 million. It finaled out at about $114.3 million. And people might be surprised that this was the movie that opened in fourth place, The Notebook, which has had a long cinematic legacy at this point, $13.4 million. Its domestic final total was $81 million. But yeah, it opened number 4 in the heart of the summer. And then in fifth place was The Terminal from Steven Spielberg, starring Tom Hanks. It dropped 31.1% in its second week at a $13.1 million weekend. Its totals at $41 million through 2 weekends, and its final domestic total ended up at $77.8 million. Of course, we don't like to just leave those numbers where they are. We like to see what they might look like in today's dollars by adjusting for inflation. And when we hit that inflation button, we see that Fahrenheit 9/11 opened to an adjusted total of $39.7 million and a final domestic total of $198.1 million. Say what you will about Michael Moore's tactics, and there is a lot to say there. He brought documentary filmmaking to an absolute new level with Fahrenheit 9/11. White Chicks opened to an adjusted total of $32.7 million and a final total of $114.9 million. Dodgeball, a true underdog story in its second week, had an adjusted weekend of $31.2 million. Its final total was at $190 million adjusted for inflation. The Notebook opened to an adjusted total of $22.3 million and a $134.6 million final adjusted total. And then The Terminal at $21.8 million had a $129.4 million adjusted total. 5 movies all making over $20 million in one weekend at the box office. We should be so lucky to have those kinds of numbers today. And that wraps things up for us here on Charts with Dan. I want to take a look at a big weekend coming up as far as the July 4th holiday. Lots of things that are hitting theaters and some stuff hitting streaming. I think I'm going to reincorporate eventually the streaming charts back into this show. I don't necessarily know if it's working on its own terms as a show, so that's going to come a little bit later, but I want to start working in some of the streaming releases into my previews of what's coming up this week. So when we look at the July 4th holiday week here in the US, Despicable Me 4 opens midweek. We often see this for July 4th, movies that are wanting to get some of that weekday business. So Despicable Me 4 opens on Wednesday. Also opening theatrically on Wednesday is an Indian action movie called Kill, which is set on a train. Looks kind of cool. And then hitting streaming on Wednesday is Beverly Hills Cop Axel F, which opens on Netflix. I'm going to be reviewing a lot of these movies. I'm not going to have time to review all of them, but Axel F is going to be one of them. Sound of Hope, the story of Possum Trot, hits theaters on Thursday. This is from Angel Studios, and they actually rebranded this film to be closer to Sound of Freedom in the hopes that they could replicate that box office success. So I guess Sound of is a franchise from them now. It's about a church community in Texas who adopted over 70 kids in foster care. And again, this movie is being rebranded as a fight for the kids thing to try to get that audience that went last summer to come back to theaters. Opening on Friday is Maxine, the final film in Ty West's X trilogy alongside Mia Goth. And then also on Friday hitting Netflix is The Imaginary from Studio Ponok, which was released in Japan last December. I included this movie on my 10 favorite films of 2024 so far. It is not quite to the level of Studio Ghibli, but it is really good. So I recommend that if you want to catch a Netflix movie that's not Beverly Hills Cop Axel F this upcoming week. And that wraps us up here on Charts with Dan. Thank you so much for watching the show. Thank you to our sponsors, Magic Spoon and Miracle Made. You can find out more about both of them down in the description below. And stay tuned right here on the channel. This is going to be a review-heavy week. I'm going to try to get in a review of 2 episodes of Star Wars The Acolyte. I'm going to try to get in Beverly Hills Cop. I'm going to get in Despicable Me 4, Maxine. Who knows? I may keep going into the weekend. There's a lot of things to watch this week, and I'm going to do my best to help guide you through them. I appreciate you watching the channel, spending some time with me as I talk about numbers. As always, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.